Um, this is the second in a series of three seminars that have been hosted by People's Land Policy and Land Justice, sort of like London. So the first seminar was about campaigns that were trying to stop the sell-off of public land. This seminar is looking at people who have acquired land, not necessarily public land, but have acquired public land and are working towards the common good, not trying to make a profit off that land. And the third seminar, which is, we'll let you know as soon as possible, would be looking at, about how we grow this movement, you know, the people actually campaigning against and people campaigning for more control over land. And it's all in aid of or supporting a Charter for Land Justice in London that we launched last year at the London Land Justice Fair in Fields Park. If you haven't seen it already, I can drop sort of like links to the charter in the chat. But we're going to start off with a presentation by Bonnie, who's going to go into everything in slightly more detail. So over to you, Bonnie.
Well, I'm really repeating a bit what I did on the first seminar. So if you were there for that one, then you'll have heard some of this. Just saying who our speakers are. We've got Juliet from Stour Trust, Cherie from Corporation Town, Danny from Bristol Commons, and I'm going to take on a new role for this meeting and actually speak myself as part of the panel. And People's Land Policy is a small group, really, a small collective, campaigning for land reform from the ground up, but not so much thinking about top-down approaches, but actually finding out from grassroots community groups what's needed, what they want, and trying to organize a grassroots movement. Because what we believe is that many of the struggles we are involved in relate to land in some way, who owns it, how it's used, how decisions are made. So this could be housing, food, community spaces, street markets, etc. We believe we need to see land as the commons, something that belongs to all of us and used for the benefit of all people and nature. And we stress stewardship rather than private ownership, and we seek to build a mass movement. So the charter, I won't go through all the demands here, but the first seminar focused on the idea of stopping the sale of public land. And the second one is actually looking at increasing public, community, and cooperative forms of ownership. So this is one of our demands. We are actually in the process of amending the charter as we have our seminars, but this is the charter as it now stands. So we've also said we would like to have introduced a community right to buy, supported by a land fund, and I shall be talking a bit about that as part of the panel. So the seminar series has this focus, bring people together to discuss practical strategies, learning from the experience of campaigns and organizations, relate this to our experience of land in general, explore how we could come together as a united land justice movement, and also make links nationally to a land justice charter. So as David said, seminar one was on defending community spaces. We had Dave from our Tottenham, Sarah from Protect Our Places, Helen from the Open Spaces Society, Tanya from Southwark Housing and Planning Emergency. So this seminar too is now looking more at alternative form ownership, the commons and commoners, getting hold of the resources, infrastructure, etc. Okay.
Okay, I think that's over to me, Bonnie. Is that right?
That is correct.
So I'm going to be the one who asks put some questions to the four panel members, and then that will be followed, by everyone having a chance to ask questions, make comments as well. And the questions are along the lines of what Bonnie's just set out on the slides. very much in terms of the charter and our interest in community and cooperative forms of ownership and how that addresses current concentrations of power in terms of who owns the land. And I'd like to ask the first question to the panel, and I'll bring you all in. It's not a kind of who wants to answer it. The style is for each person to answer each question, and we have a bit of a method of giving different people a chance to lead. The first question, and I'm going to turn to you, Danny, to start us off on this one. The first question's really the introductory question. Could you share with us all some information about your organisation and particularly um, how community and cooperative forms of ownership and control is important to what your organisation is all about? And secondly, we're interested to know a bit around how you see ownership in terms of the community side. Have you got examples of outright ownership, or are we talking about different lengths of lease? We'd like to tease that out in this first round of questions. And Danny, could you start us off on this first question?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thanks for inviting me. Lovely to be here. Well, I'm from the Bristol Commons, and I think the first thing to say is I'm sort of sitting here feeling a little bit of a fraud because we don't actually own anything.
Really?
But that will become clear in a moment. So the Bristol Commons is a project that our organisation Coexist launched about 3 years ago as an invitation to see whether or not Bristol wanted to start to recommon the city. And we invited all sorts of different interesting speakers and people to sort of present ideas, but also the sort of wider community of organizations and groups and individuals and anybody who wanted to come really that was interested in this idea, this proposition. And it comes from being custodians of a huge building, so 55,000 square foot of office space that Coexist transformed into what was at the time the UK's largest grassroots community hub in Hamilton House. And we ran it for 10 years and it was very successful. And it had some very interesting metrics. So, at the sort of peak, it generated over £21 million to the local economy. It had 20,000 visitors a month. It had 500 resident artists, social enterprises, and charities. So we'd created this ecosystem that really was, although we didn't know it, something of a commons. And unfortunately, not having ownership of that building, but just being there on a short-term lease, when the owner died and his brother took over and didn't really understand what a social enterprise was, just wanted to maximize the profit on it, we were evicted. And that sort of set into motion this, first of all, huge community trauma, displacing that many people, losing their jobs, many of them. I know that one person that lost their home. There was a real sense of, well, we can't do this here in Bristol. And sort of dispersing everybody so that the sort of benefits of that ecosystem were lost. But the inquiry is to, well, how can we actually create this systemic change, which really sort of centers around land justice? That sort of came into motion. And that's really why the invitation to launch the Bristol Commons happened. And as a result, 3 years on from that instigation of the Bristol Commons, actually 7 years on since the eviction from Hamilton House, we have quite an interesting movement of, we've had over 1,500 people come through and participate into co-creating it. I'd say there are probably about 35, 40 people that regularly sort of power the movement and keep it moving forward. We've had many different sort of festivals, big sort of events, small working groups that are kind of working away on different aspects. But this key thing about ownership comes into play because one of the groups that we were working with, someone in the group, is part of a community space that was run by a Methodist church. And they were sort of in danger of being evicted too because the church was being sold and lots of developers were sniffing around. And we'd hired that space a few times for meetings. And so we were invited into those early conversations. And they, from the very beginning, were sort of convinced, right, we need to bring this into the Commons. And so working with that sort of incumbent group of studio holders and space users and concerned residents, the Bristol Commons as a sort of network, which is still not constituted, although it has strategic aims, objectives and values and a mission statement, it's not an official legal institution yet, started to work to see how we could bring that into not just community ownership, but community stewardship. So for us, these two things sort of sit hand in hand. And we were lucky enough to encounter a very sort of enthusiastic Methodist church, and they wanted to pass it on into community hands, and they really liked the idea of the Commons and community ownership. And so we have a deal in place with them and a price agreed for the purchase of the building. And we have until about October to raise the funds. And we're going to do that through a community share offer. And so to just round up the first part, the organisation is Coexist, actually. That will be the legal entity that holds the asset. But it will be run very much as a commons, because all of the kind of co-owners that participate in the share offer and buy a community share will have that kind of legal ownership. But it will sit within this wider, as yet unconstituted, but soon to be, probably as a community or a charitable community benefit society, the Bristol Commons, which will hold a wider membership of people and groups and organisations, actually, that are all working towards recommoning Bristol. And this would be the sort of first asset, if you like, traditional asset in that sense, that will be collectively stewarded or commoned. So that's really kind of like a bit about the organisation and a bit about sort of community ownership. And in terms of how we see it, well, we see it really actually as relational first and foremost. That's a really key thing about commons and commoning. I think lots of people view commons as, oh, that's just about the assets and holding something in shared ownership. Actually, it's not. It's about the relationship we have with each other as commoners and the assets, or the land, the building, the ecosystem itself, including, you could say the more than human or the non-human as well. So if you are talking about a piece of land, obviously the diversity of sort of non-human life forms there is much greater. But we recognize that this building, needs to service the wider community, the sort of the aims of the kind of recommoning movement, and also future generations. So we're really seeing it as this sort of portal into connecting us with many, many, many different people, many of whom we don't yet know. And that's a sort of a big responsibility, really. And so when we talk about ownership, that's really mainly a kind of a legal construct for us. It's really the stewardship that we sort of tend to focus on, and we're looking at what those legal mechanisms are that we can do to sort of hack the the current structures in order to enable real kind of commoning and sort of that equal stewardship. Because as you said, I think it was the second point in your sort of charter, you were asking for new forms of sort of community ownership, and that's really important, because I think the current ones are okay, but they don't do enough. And really, if we're going to sort of break down some of the kind of like capitalist ideologies and the imperialist sort of cultures that we've all inherited and kind of within us, whether we like it or not, even if we kind of work against that and work to sort of purge that from our systems and our culture.
Okay, Danny,
we need, just to finish off, we
come to an end there.
Yeah, what we need to do is we really need to have the models that kind of facilitate those values and facilitate that kind of work together.
That's great. Of course, the first question's going to be require a longer answer than all the others, so we do factor that in. Could you just very quickly give us a little bit of information about the length of leases that you've got? Do you have any 99-year ones, or are they like 2 or 3 or 5 year? How does the leasing side work?
Within the Bristol Commons, there are lots of different organisations, and they all have different relationships to their buildings. And so, for example, an organisation that has recently been awarded a community asset transfer has 120-year asset transfer. Yeah. Others are on more like 25, 30-year. as I said at the beginning with Hamilton House, that lease actually was only kind of a year rolling lease and provided no security. So the Coexist as an organisation made a commitment not to go down the leasehold route anymore. And actually, it's really interested in systemic change. And to do that, we really believe that we have to have community ownership as a foundation for what we invest our time, energy, and innovation into.
Great, great. Thanks very much, Danny. Shiri, could you introduce Cooperation Town and your approach to cooperatives, and then end up a bit on on how you approach the leasing as well?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm a co-founder and co-organizer at Corporation Town, and what we do is coordinate very lightly a movement of community food co-ops. I'm coming to this meeting a little bit exhausted because I just helped a new group of people to start a new co-op. There would be the 68th, I think, in our movement in Margate. And there are community food co-ops, usually a group of 20 neighbors who come together to organize around the food that they source and share themselves. And from there, the idea is that, people learn how to organize around something very easy, where there's basically no risk. Mathematically, you can't lose money. There is, the biggest risk you get is that, I don't know, you get the wrong kind of potatoes that you don't like. And for people to build the confidence and the skills and the networks to then organize around things that are maybe a little bit more risky, like organizing at our workplaces and organizing around housing, and land can be part of that. So basically developing the skills to build power in our communities, on our streets, on our estates, in our class, so that we can grow this power and kind of fight the powers that are there to oppress us. In terms of ownership, the co-ops are very, I suppose, ephemeral, in the sense that they are groups of people who organize on a weekly cycle. So people, members source together food and share it and distribute it, and they basically go through their accounts. They kind of usually almost deplete their accounts every week to start again. So for a very short time, they kind of own something together, and then they distribute it to themselves. In terms of where they are, co-ops in our movement are hosted by organizations, and that would normally be sort of community centers, churches, mosques, pubs, TRA halls, public places that are accessible, that are usually kind of owned by the community in one way or another. And our co-ops are kind of guests or they're stakeholders in those spaces when they organize, and they usually do it on a weekly cycle. Corporation Town Hub, our organization, is based in Camden, in North London. And we sit in this hub. We've got a social center and a logistics hub where we host, I think, 14 co-ops. So different groups at different times of the day, of the week, come here to organize their own co-ops. So they're completely autonomous. We don't tell them what to do and how to organize. We just kind of developed an infrastructure that is an organizational infrastructure in terms of supporting people to learn how to organize and to become organizers in their community. And where we can, we support a logistics infrastructure that is just enabling that organizing. So like I said, there's loads of co-ops come here because we have this space, and there's about 2 tons of food circulating through this space every week that goes, comes in and goes out to the co-ops. We have a very informal lease on this building. It's a kind of temporary space. We know that it will be part of a redevelopment one time soon. We are, in terms of the timescale, we were told between 1.5 years and 7 years. So who knows? It is our 3rd, potentially 4th space. Our previous space, which kind of formed the same kind of purpose, is now 48 luxury flats somewhere in Camden. in this space, though, we have, outside of organizing space for co-ops, we have a living room, which is a meeting space for neighbors, where they can, get every day of the week, either cooked lunch or dinner. People meet each other, people do workshops, people go on outings, and so on. We have a learning garden, where we grow food 12 months a year. We have, what do we have? Community laundrette, which is kind of another form of all these projects come out of our members. So we never decided to do all those things. They came out of our relationship with members, where we kind of have this infrastructure is for everyone. We just we maybe have the relationship with the council, but we say yes to all good ideas. So the community laundrette, for example, came out of members who said, the flats are too small, they get super damp and full of mold, and we don't have a place for, both my kids to run around and for me to dry my washing. And we're like, well, this used to be an old nursery, and here is a small room which had like tiny toilets that nobody needs anymore. Why don't we just put some washing machines and dryers in there? And that community laundrette runs itself. We print out a sheet and people just put their names, and it runs all the hours that we are open. There are people doing their washing here, and the washing machine is, we learned, an incredible piece of organizing technology, because you have somebody here for 2 hours and you can talk about food co-ops and about growing, and about joining the living room and getting their lunch or benefits advice, or joining the menopause cafe, or joining our free therapy project, or whatever else that members come up with that we are able to run here, because we have that piece of infrastructure. Like I said, this building will be going, and we will be moving to another building. So we are now in a relationship with the council over redeveloping an empty piece of, well, it's not land, it's a building, it's like some kind of car park. We already brought in the designers, the architects and the engineers and so on, to kind of prove to the council that it can be redeveloped into a meaningful, piece of infrastructure for the community to replace this one day. It's around the corner. We insisted that we have to stay in the neighborhood, like Danny was saying about Bristol. Like, you can't just build a whole project and then take it away from the neighborhood. So that's what's coming soon.
Okay, that's fine. I know it's hard, the first question, because you're not sure, no one's sure how much to cover. But if you could just finally, because you mentioned it was the 68th, I think you said at the start today in Margate. Just briefly, can you give us an idea of which parts of London you're particularly strong in, and then outside of London, can you give a few, just a list really of different towns outside London too?
Yeah. So most co-ops are in London, and of those, most are in Camden, and that is because we have this piece of infrastructure here. So because we have, we kind of increased our logistical capacity by having so many co-ops at the same time, and it's like it's like a feedback loop. Otherwise, we have an organizer, sort of people who are community co-op organizers, part of our movement in Sheffield, Plymouth, and Oxford. And those are places where there are, again, concentration of co-ops, because there is a local organizer that is part of our movement. And then there are co-ops that are kind of around, floating in, around England. I don't know where everyone is here on this call, but if you are in a place where there isn't a community food co-op, get in touch with me.
Yeah,
and we
right.
can help you make one. There's none in Bristol, which is shocking.
Yeah. Yes, that might be a nice connection. That's great for now, Shiri. And then Juliet, and then after Juliet, Bonnie. Juliet, could you
Thank you.
describe for us about Stour Trust and
Absolutely.
yeah.
And our story is very similar actually to the story of Bristol Commons. So the first phase of the Stour journey started in 2008 when a collective of residents, artists and practitioners in Hackneywick and Fish Island came together to take over an abandoned warehouse that had been empty for 20 years and essentially self-built it into an incredible community infrastructure that provided an art gallery, 45 studios for artists and creatives and businesses. We built a cafe. We were the local polling station. We were the public facing building of Fish Island that then connected to the local authority with regards to what would then be the Olympics coming to the area. And we were on short-term leases of 3 years over the period of a decade. And essentially, we became a vital infrastructure for ourselves and for the local community, not realizing that we were under threat. We just thought we'd be there forever, stewarding with these collective principles, which really embedded skill sharing. We would have our kitchens in the evenings would be given for free to a local chef to create a meal for the community. It's our first building was along a canal, so boaters would sort of dock and help themselves to water and use our bathroom. So it really just became what the community wanted without an agenda, but just an infrastructure that was open from 8 a.m. till 2 a.m. for us. And then obviously over that decade, just like the story of Bristol Commons, our landlord then saw the value that came out of the asset and actually then quantified that into the value that he wanted us to pay for our lease. And over time, that just became very unaffordable. And so, yeah, a decade later, we were at risk of being evicted because we just couldn't retain the level of rent that our landlord wanted and still keep our values and our principles and the affordability and accessibility of our asset for us. And through that, we decided that perhaps one of the ways to take ownership of the asset was to acquire it. But we didn't really have any reserves or capital investment to approach the landlord and just buy it outright. So we heard about the asset of community value policy under the Localism Act, and in 2015 or 2014 even, we were one of I think the third in the country to utilize this to utilize this policy to apply to the council to register the building on Fish Island as an asset of community value, which gave us 6 months essentially to fundraise and negotiate a price with the landlord, and they were very accommodating and actually gave us a figure. But at that time, in order to kind of go through all the due diligence with the various social impact investors that were available at the time, took on average 18 months, and we could only cap the asking price for 6 months. So over a period of 18 months, the asking price quadrupled. And essentially, had we purchased the building, it would have set a precedent for the area of one of the highest sort of purchase building of Hackney and Fish Island. So we would be part of the problem we were trying to kind of extinguish. So we decided that that wouldn't be the way. And so Stour Trust was then incorporated essentially to look at, what would it look like to have a building that could last beyond our lifetime. So the word legacy was really very strongly discussed amongst our community, and then became the journey started for us to kind of figure out what that route would be, not having any access to capital funds. And the route we used was actually through a planning policy called the Section 106, which essentially meant that every development that was being built particularly on Hackney and Fish Island, had to deliver a community asset for a period of time. I think the policy at the time was a minimum of 7 years at an affordable rate. After 7 years of negotiation, we managed to increase that 7 years into 999 years. So essentially a virtual freehold, and managed to negotiate a peppercorn lease. So essentially that was a 7-year journey. I won't go into it right now, but the asset itself will be delivered in 2028. It was meant to be 2027, but as we know, the economics of the world means that developers are having to find their money in different places as well. So that's the first asset that we have an agreement for lease of, and we are currently also negotiating a second asset, which will be a peppercorn lease for 248 years. That's a private developer in Mile End. And then a third asset that we're negotiating in a collective with 15 other community members in Hackney will be a council-owned building that we hope to get a 25-year lease and potentially convert that into community asset transfer. So that's sort of like the assets that we are working towards. And in terms of what that looks like in terms of economy principles, I think there's a tension here between governance structures that feed planning policy needs, that feed funding needs, and then that feeds community needs. And I think we find ourselves in that middle piece. So we are registered as an asset, as a CIC with an asset lock, but we also, like Danny, we find that there are the models that we want to interrogate that actually gives us more collective power, that allows us to live our principles. So we're using the CIC model as a means to an end, but we see this journey as there's there's one model to kind of hold the asset, but actually how we practice the use of the asset and how we are together within the stewarding of the asset will, yes, it's situated differently. And maybe that doesn't even need an official governance structure, but actually a set of principles that we've lived before, actually, for over a decade, which is around the sharing economy. How do we actually value things like care and love and solidarity and wellness and kindness within our communities, and how does that spread beyond the building itself and the infrastructure? So yeah, so that's how sort of our 15-year journey, let's say, and yeah, we see us as looking at leases that at least can be held beyond our lifetime, and minimum for us is 99 years, preferably 999. Ideally, we would have enough resource to buy assets, in London off the market, but we are in an urban environment, so we're using Section 106s as a means to get the longer leases.
Yeah, thanks. It's so encouraging that you have this ambition of very long leases, because we hear so often very short ones around us, and it's so important that we push for what you're doing. So thanks for all that encouragement. Thanks very much. Finally, on the first round, Bonnie, could you introduce Community Land Scotland? Is Bonnie still there?
I think you're muted, Bonnie.
Yeah, I'm muted. Yeah. So I'm not officially a member of I'm a member of Community Land Scotland, but as a supporting member. I'm also a member of the Community Land Academic Network because I did my anthropology research in the Cairngorms of Scotland, and I became very interested in the land issue there. So I've been keeping up with everything over the years, and it's really what got me started in wanting to do land justice things in London. And I think the whole community land thing in Scotland is incredibly interesting. So it's a community ownership is a very much a geographical community. So and the people who own the communities that own the land, it's in perpetuity. So there's no lease involved. It's something that they have forever. So it's not private individual or the state, local and nationally, but it is whatever the local community is. At the moment, about 3% of Scottish land is in community ownership, mostly in rural areas, but increasingly in urban areas. So it does include buildings. So when the Community Land Scotland talks about what are the land that we're talking about, it could be a large estate with, grouse moors and agricultural land, crofting land, or it could be a local park, it could be a garden, it could be a community building, or it could be housing. So really, we're talking about any kind of asset, I guess is the word to use, though I don't particularly like the word asset. But it's a lot of different things. So it's not just some obscure island off the west coast of Scotland, though it is that as well. So that's it, really. It's a completely different model. It's where they actually. I was going to talk in one of the later questions, but just to explain that it's possible because of the land reform legislation that's given quite a lot of power to the idea of community right to buy. And it's very different from the community asset transfer model that we have in England and Wales. So the community has the right to buy, and they can. And it's negotiated. They negotiate with private landowners normally, but the point is that the community often has the right of first refusal, and there also exists a first refusal. Yes, if something comes up for sale. There's also legislation on the idea that if a current landowner is causing harm or leaving something underused or not for the public benefit, then the community has the right to bid for it. And there exists a land fund. And I think this is really quite important. So it's money from the Scottish government that's given to groups to actually buy whatever they're trying to buy. Now, this does often involve a lot of fundraising. So the Langholm estate in southern Scotland, for example, is a large estate, 4,250 hectares. And they bought the land from the Duke of Buccleuch. They had to raise £6 million. So they got some of the money from the land fund, but they also had to do some fundraising, similar to what people are talking about. It's just that there's just much more legislative support for communities actually buying the land, and that includes buildings and different urban community assets. Such as, I know some people bought a church from the Church of England, for example. It was a community building, and there's whole housing estates that are under community ownership.
Thanks, Bonnie. And I know you'll be able to provide all the detail as we go through the other questions. So that's great. So we've actually got three more questions. We would like this part of the discussion to be a little more pacey. We deliberately wanted enough time for the first question, but we're now like really quite short 2-3 minute answers for the remaining questions. And the first question is asking you about within your community spaces, your co-ops, community assets. Can you describe for us who is involved and how they are involved? And so that we're actually applying the steward role, the commons, the co-op, and actually looking at, well, who are the commoners in your cases, and how actually are they involved in the running of the community space? And for this question, we'd like to start off with Cooperation Town, then Stour Trust, then Bonnie, then Bristol. So we're trying to mix it as we go along. But if Cherie, if you could start on this question of who are the commoners, who's involved, how are they involved?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think I touched on it a little bit earlier. Cooperation town co-ops are essentially groups of neighbours on streets and estates around the country. So, and they don't necessarily have a relationship of ownership with the spaces that they're organising in. This is an explicitly working class project. We are very open about who we would put our efforts into organizing. But I feel like I could, wearing maybe a different hat of like housing co-ops, because I'm also involved in developing housing co-ops. Obviously, that's a completely different that's a completely different structure and relation of ownership to buildings and to homes, where obviously the members are the members of housing co-ops, and they're usually groups that organize themselves, and they're often sort of come together around a political idea of or organizing methodology. At the moment, I'm supporting a new co-op that is going to own 58 new homes, which is the biggest co-op development in London, I think, in many, many years. And that is for members for members who are from Black and global majority backgrounds only in Haringey, so quite specific demographics. And that's a very different relationship, and we are in the process of buying the homes from Peabody with a grant from the GLA and with a mortgage.
Yeah, and in terms of who's involved, who makes decisions, is it a traditional, the members of the co-op make decisions, or do you go a bit wider than that because it's neighborhood based?
No, so according to core principles, only the people who are affected by the decisions are able to make decisions. So all the decisions in the co-ops are made by members. We, as the sort of the coordinators of the movement, have no say over any decisions that co-ops make themselves.
Okay, yeah, got that. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Juliet, Stour Trust.
Hello, back again. So for us, as I mentioned, we have two assets being negotiated and three in the pipe, and the third one in the pipeline. And I would say that in terms of our work, we kind of model it under three layers. So we have sort of the resistance, because we've come from a resistant movement of, we don't want to be displaced. We don't want to necessarily leave the communities where we thrive and where we have ecosystems of support and care. So our resistance part of our work is usually supported by organisers. So in Hackney Wick, we have a collective of incredible artists, community members, residents, and we meet once a month at a forum called Creative CIG, which is called the Cultural Interest Group, that's been running monthly without fail for over a decade. And that's where decisions are made, that's where we organise, that's sort of where we challenge planning applications and invite developers to kind of be accountable to us. And then in the work we're doing in Hackney, it's 50 local Black and Global majority organisations who have been displaced and don't have any place to actually operate, who are helping and informing our work with the bid to take over and steward an asset in Hackney. And similarly in Mile End, it's residents and local communities who have been working to retain this asset for over a decade, who we've collaborated with to inform, how they want that building to be secured and also what they want in those buildings. But in terms of the governance structure, Stour Trust, there are 3 directors at that governance level. And as I said before, we've structured that as a very much a way to ensure pace, but also to respond to the crisis that our communities are facing. We found that when we were working as a more of a collective Stour phase 1, we were not able to respond fast enough to funding, but also to respond to the planning application and to respond to the resistance. So we almost have this 2-pronged approach of like the traditional governance structure that kind of works at pace, and then the kind of the organizing structure that kind of delivers the asset. And then within that, we also have obviously the funders who are part of the story because they do have power. So that's an interesting juxtaposition, because we're also trying to, in our own way, challenge the mechanisms and the processes that communities need to be able to draw down resources fast enough and quick enough to respond to the needs as they emerge. And sometimes that doesn't fit within a traditional funding structure. So we're kind of, like Dan said, we're kind of hacking the system as we go along with all of these stakeholders, and hopefully new processes would emerge. But it's an interesting dance, I would say.
Yeah. And do you use the term at all of commoners? Would you use cooperative members? Or do you use different terms?
Yes, I think we in terms of our practice, we see ourselves as a commons. And it's interesting for us to we embody that in our day-to-day practice and our day-to-day interaction with each other. But I would also say that part of what we are interrogating when we are working with power, let's say, is how we can translate that language, and we're forced to translate that language to the power structure. So I find that we do use different languages depending on what rooms we're in. I don't know if that
absolutely.
resonates as well. Yeah.
Okay. Bonnie, over to you.
Yes, I think I needed to stress a little bit before my first part about the idea of stewardship. When I met people from community that were community landowners when I went to a conference a couple of years ago, I did feel that the people felt, so the people who are involved are everyone in the community. So, but you have to live there. So you have to be part of that locality. But I felt that they saw themselves as stewards, even though officially it's called community land ownership. When you look at the sort of ethos, they talk about managing the land for both community and nature, and they talk about managing the land for both current and future generations. So they deliberately are aiming to have different goals, different ways of approaching the land than a private landowner or whatever asset, whether it be a building or a park or whatever. So, for example, that I met one crofter and who had his grandfather had come back from the war, and he was really had hoped that things would change after World War II, and they didn't. And he goes, that now the fact that we have the land, he said, it just would have meant so much to my grandfather. And when he talked to me, he very much talked about our land. He didn't say my land or my bit of the community land. It was our land. So the commoners, the people involved, are the people who live there. And obviously, how they're involved becomes quite difficult, because we know that in all situations there's various hierarchies. And in the different community land situations is a very different number of people. So the Isle of Egg has about 100 people on the island making decisions. And then you've got much bigger estates where you could maybe have thousands needing to make decisions. So then in the urban areas, it becomes much more complicated because, as people have already explained for Bristol and London, that you could have people come from different places to be involved in a particular building or a particular community space. So it gets much more complicated, and community land ownership has more difficulty in urban areas where who are the commoners or who is the community becomes a little bit more difficult. And the community, before they can do the buyout, officially buy the land, they have to have a democratic structure in place. They have to show that they have a way of making decisions before they're allowed to take the land. So they have to have a way of making sure people can participate, everyone can participate. Again, easier said than done. The Community Land Scotland itself is a member-led organization that in a way provides the infrastructure for all the different community buyouts. And they are a member-led organization. And so it's the different members, the different communities, owners who make up Community Land Scotland, and they elect the board, and they have regular conferences and where people come together to make decisions. Again, it's the community as autonomy, but by coming to these national meetings, they're able to hear about what other people are doing and share experience, etc. And the Community Land Scotland also provides some expertise as well, some infrastructure. So it's quite interesting, is that, but what do you do about the issue of people who have an interest in the land, but who don't actually live there? So in Scotland, this becomes an issue for environmental issues mainly. And it could be an issue in London if you had something like a park. So people might not live next to the park, but people might come from all over London to use the park. So who gets to make decisions about that park? So in Scotland, you have areas, for example, the Isle of Skye, where a lot of people come for mountain climbing and hiking, and there's a big conservation interest. So who gets to make decisions? Is it just the people who actually live there? And then how long do you have to live there for? The issue of income and native, who gets to make decisions. So in theory, it should be fairly straightforward, but I would argue that it can be incredibly complicated. But that's why projects that people have just talked about, Bristol Commons, Stour Trust, and Corporation Town, people getting practice in making decisions and being involved and not handing over power to others is really important.
Thanks. Danny, who are the commoners in Bristol Commons?
Well, they are quite a broad bunch of people. It sort of depends upon what we're looking at. So, for example, I mentioned earlier on, there's probably about 30 to 40 people who are currently doing the majority of the sort of commoning work in terms of evolving our structure and designing kind of campaign materials and membership models and all the kind of things that I guess an evolving network and movement really requires to be sort of successful in this paradigm that we live in. And I think it would be fair to say that lots of people have been drawn to this by shared values. And many people whose stories are intertwined quite often with precarious living arrangements. So most people are renting, to be honest. There are a few people who own their own homes. And many people have been sort of share a story of eviction in some form or another. We have different groups, and so within the sort of structure of the Bristol Commons, we use sociocracy, or a sort of form of shared governance to make decisions and to sort of in terms of our kind of like organizational framework and design. And within that, there are two anchor organizations at all times. Now, currently in this sort of founding era, we have Coexist, which basically takes the role of a sort of a community organization. Whoever replaces Coexist in the future will have to be orientated around sort of community work, community arts, that kind of thing. And the second organization is Diverse Artists Network, and they take the role of the organization that needs to really be led by diverse and marginalized people. And so we're sort of building into our structure, sort of, I guess, resource and oversight around, the key issues and identities that are kind of key to what we want to promote and evolve and nurture. And we have another structure called the Heart Circle, which offers, I guess, sort of oversight or inner sight around the decisions that are made. So coming back, you were talking about assets, earlier on. So, it's good to think of expanded conceptions of assets, really, not just being a building or land, but the relationships, that really kind of underpin that. But the building itself that we're going to be purchasing is really being, that whole practice is sort of being developed by one particular circle within the sociocratic structure, which is focused on that building, and they tend to be artists, studio holders, concerned residents, very local people to the building, and building users. So kind of quite a good mix of people that really have a relationship with it, really. That's the most important thing. And with each other. And that's really kind of growing. It's that kind of culture of commoning that we're tending to. So I couldn't really necessarily say demographics, although if I was going to kind of refer to that sort of 30, 40 people, I'd say currently the majority of people are, I would say, middle class, not working class, unlike Corporation Town. And that's, has its own sort of problems that it sort of brings along with it, as well as the privileges and benefits of that too. But what I would say is that there's a lot of work being done within the movement to consistently sort of reach out to more and more people different to ourselves. And I think that's a really interesting and important part of being in a city which is so diverse. We have a responsibility to sort of like nurture a community that everybody can kind of look at and go, yeah, I belong there. That's somewhere where I feel safe. That's somewhere I see people that kind of like look and sound and sort of I guess resonate with me.
Yeah, good. Not everyone might be used to sociocracy. So in the chat, maybe, because I've noticed you're quite happy using the chat a bit. If there's anything that comes to your mind that you can share on sociocracy, that would be wonderful, because not everyone will be familiar with it. But thanks a lot, Danny. Moving on to question 3, and just so that you're ready, Juliet, I'm going to ask you to start on this one. And the question here is looking at some of the challenges. So in terms of what you've described so far, what would you identify as the main challenges? And then really slightly linked to that, we're interested in the educational work that you do, if you call it that. Because in our charter, our Land Justice Charter, we've actually got a demand about the importance of community education to actually give the skills and knowledge about land stewardship and so on. So it would be nice at this point to hear from those of you who are involved in that, to actually talk about that community education role as well. So main challenges and community education role, and could I invite you, Juliet, to start on this one?
Thank you. Challenges, gosh, where to begin? I mean, obviously, our context is very much London, gentrification, resistance, context over the last 15 years. I would say some of the challenges for us has been the length of time it's taken us and many others like us to actually secure an asset, whether that is through outright acquisition and or using policies like I've mentioned before, whether that's ACV or Section 106. And that takes time. So the working with communities that have hope, that have ambition, that have intention and give their time to do that over a period of 5, 6, 7, 10 years needs such an embedded level of trust. Because you do need different postures. You need to kind of give agency to certain people to take on roles and negotiate on behalf of communities, but also bring communities along on, an imagination of a journey in a way, because you don't know what the future will hold, but actually keeping them on that journey for a decade needs different components, from incredible organizers to leaders from within communities that can translate between different sectors. Part of the challenge, I would also say, is really understanding, for us, it has been understanding the planning system and also the gap that exists between us as lay people who have come into this practice because we live somewhere or we care about a place, and then even with our different expertise, really trying to get to grasp with things like, what are the planning conditions and what are Section 106s, and, where can we go into planning committee meetings and why do they happen in the evening, and actually who has a right to be there. So that's been a long journey. And for us, part of the education has been to not only learn that for ourselves in the moment, but also then how to translate that to bringing other communities along on that journey and supporting others that are going through similar experiences across London. I think the other challenge I'd mention is probably resourcing. As much as you can use sweat and in-kind nourishment, there comes a point where when you're doing negotiation, you're going to need a lawyer, and you might need an architect, and you might need to do a feasibility plan, and you might need to do a light touch business plan on top of that, and you might need to do a funding application, and you might need to create a governance structure. So all of that, more often than not, will need an expert or at least someone who has knowledge of that, but also real cash. So the question is, where does that cash come from at pace? And I think that's been, for us, if we had to pay for the legal cost of getting our 9-year lease, it might have cost well over 6 figures. But we were fortunate enough to have a low bono legal practitioner. So I think part of the challenge and the gap is sort of like, what kind of infrastructure do we need in our communities to get us to steward the assets that we want to steward for the length of time we want to steward? That's a question. I can kind of give some answers to that. So I think part of the challenge has been also credibility. I think within the context of how we've worked, we've been negotiating with developers, and I think there's something about the credibility of how they see communities in quotation mark, and when they hear the word community and charitable and social impact and words that we use sometimes to get into the room. I think that's been a challenge to hold ourselves authentically with our values and not dilute that while we go through the process. And that has meant that sometimes we've had to walk away from certain situations. That's probably why it took 7 years, because we didn't want to get less than what we felt was right for our communities. And that means sometimes you have to make some difficult decisions that some community members might not agree with. So how holding space for difference, I think, is an interesting challenge within this work. And then the last thing I'll mention is also about power. I think we have to recognize that to do this, there will come a point where power dynamics do play, because we are in a capitalistic system where sometimes you need to hold certain power to get things done. But then how do you hold power in a way that is with care and that acknowledges the position you're in, and then also have the ability to step back and let others be in the room. I think part of the education is being able to do that in a way that is embodied and that also feels right for your community. So I'll stop there for now. I think the second part of the question, I hope I answered, let me just read it here. Maybe you can remind me. The skills.
That's it. That's
Oh,
it.
yeah, that's it. Perfect. Okay.
Your community education work in brief.
Yes,
In brief.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So that we were very much became aware that, or for ourselves, that for us to achieve what we achieved, would be very difficult to go to a traditional education institution and learn this, because there's so many different components that don't necessarily fit within a nice box. When we talk about, you go from talking about governance models to talking about healing and justice and so there is something about creating space for organizers and leaders to step into gaps in their experience and potentially things they want to learn in a way that's succinct and appropriate and at the pace at which they're at. And for us, that's been working with incredible organizations like Stir to Action. We've got I think House of Annetta is doing a series of incredible courses soon, which is, I think I'd ask everyone to have a look at that. So for us, we found that our role as we do this work is to kind of go out in communities and share our knowledge and talk to communities about our experience, but also share just basic information about our journey, but also almost we delivered something called the ABCs with Stir to Action in South London, in Ambeth and Southwark. And it was wonderful to just be able to be in a room and community members could come with specific questions that we could hack collectively. And normally there were just little knots. It could be as simple as, we're going into this meeting with the council to negotiate X, and they have this clause, we don't know what it means. How would you approach it? And then collectively we can kind of give almost like a co-created response to that, because we've all had in our practice different experiences, and because there isn't necessarily a one size fits all, because their experience is so unique, we can kind of crowdsource that intelligence. So what I feel is missing is almost a place for us to pool all this knowledge somewhere, that's not just paper based but very practical in a way that's useful. I'll stop there.
Okay, that's great, and I can tell that Danny's expressing some empathy with this. So Danny, I'll invite you next to follow what Juliet's set out there. How does it work for you in Bristol?
It's a great. I just really appreciated what you were saying, Juliet, because it felt like many of those kind of struggles, and I think you used the word an interesting dance before. We're sort of dancing with too, and I think there is something particularly interesting about kind of navigating power, and talking about it very sort of openly. And it's quite interesting because I think that a lot of the people that are attracted to this kind of work, many of them at least, and I'd count myself originally in this as well, are very wary and resistant to holding power. And I think that we need to become more comfortable and nuanced and experienced in kind of holding and utilizing collective power, and really sort of practicing that and understanding what that means, and interrogating, where our individual power is within that, and making sure that we are, doing that merry dance of kind of stepping back and giving space to others, and at the same time as when it's needed, really kind of stepping forward and being able to kind of leverage our power effectively, in sort of service of the whole, the commons and its aims, and the sort of people and relationships within it. It definitely feels like it's a constantly evolving place that we're in. Maddie shared a diagram of our kind of current sociocratic structure, and that's something which has recently been sort of reconstellated, and took about 4 or 5 months, to be honest, to really kind of get that level of coherence. And so doing things slowly at the speed of trust is really, really important. And taking the time to sort of bring new people that step in on board and sort of up to speed and feeling kind of confident in contributing and participating. And that's kind of really where I think it sort of comes to life in Bristol, is that we've put a lot of energy and attention into sort of our culture of commoning. And I think that that's really got to be the sort of bedrock, really, because, no matter whether we're successful in transvesting assets into the commons, which, confident we will be, beyond that, we need to do this work of kind of practicing commoning and living in a way which is not necessarily challenging the kind of capitalist system, but just sort of living in a way alongside it. Very, very kind of enamored with this idea of a parallel polis, something, a structure system which sort of exists in parallel with the sort of wider system, so that we can use that more and more to meet our needs, and spend our time and put our energy and innovation into, until eventually it really does work, and it really is something that kind of can support a sort of quite a large ecosystem. And maybe that's when the kind of old system starts to kind of finally sort of crumble away a bit and be composted.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, is there anything more specific in terms of how it works in Bristol that you'd like me to just touch on briefly?
That's okay for now, but there may be some questions in a little bit, and then we can draw you out more then. Yeah, but that's great for now.
I'll finish with one thing, actually, that's all right, Richard, just to say that our decisions are made by consent, and this is a real important thing, because it's one of the founding principles of sociocracy, and spending time with people so that they can get the hang of that process and participate in it, and they get to experience what it means to make decisions together and come out of that feeling like they've really participated, is a really important part of what we do.
Yeah. Bonnie, for Community Land Scotland, what are some of the key challenges, and is there a community education response there?
Yeah, so I think that the difference, I think, with some of the examples in Scotland, especially if you're talking about Ireland or something, is it's not like it's a group of people who have come together for a particular purpose, like a food co-op, or because there's a building that they have been working in together. People who are just living in the area, by definition, become part of the project, become part of community, and become owners with everyone else. So it's not always straightforward to get everyone to agree. Even in an island, you could have, people told me at the conference that you could have, I think one buyer was about 8 families, and there's a lot of conflict between those 8 families. So they might unite in order to say, well, we want to own our land and our housing and our buildings, etc. But beyond that, what to do once they do own it, they don't necessarily agree. And I think this is a challenge. One of the crofters told me at the conference that he said, in theory, we're all meant to be looking after nature as well as the needs of the people in our communities, he said, but a lot of people don't. So a lot of people who are in the communities might feel that what they really want to do is get into carbon trading, build massive wind farms, or whatever else might bring wealth into the community. So there's potential for conflict. And how do you deal with those conflicts? Because the communities now have the right to make decisions about how their land is used, but how do you decide when there's actually different viewpoints? So do you allow high deer numbers? Do you actually kill the deer in order to allow the trees to grow? What actually do you do? And in urban areas, it could be similar, though, because in urban areas, it's more of a precise location, like a particular building or a particular project, then it is different. But the biggest challenge, I would say, is the issue of money. So the Community Land Scotland and other community landowners that make it up would obviously like to see the amount of land under communityship expanded. However, the land fund is limited. It actually had cuts last year. And they're busy campaigning now because between 2015 2024, the Scottish Land Fund actually gave over £50 million to more than 300 community organisations to actually do the community buyout. So we're not really sure what's going to happen next after. It depends a lot on the election because there's 150 projects waiting for funding. And the estimated capital request is 23 million. So that is their challenge, is making sure that the money is going to come through, because I would argue that despite the rhetoric a lot of the Scottish government, they still haven't really challenged fundamentally the Scottish landowner system. The other challenge, I think, is one that people have already touched on, is the issue of hierarchies within communities. So some people have refused, so they don't want to buy the land in their community. They say, because we don't have time. Because how much time does it take to actually make all the decisions, work out what you're going to do, go to meetings, etc., etc. So you need to get the skills in order to do that. And I found it interesting that I met quite a few incomers to some of these places in Scotland who are from England, and they were accepted readily in the community because they had the necessary skills. So several of them were accountants, so they were retired accountants. So they could come, they came to the area and they would then provide accounting skills. So it's difficult to make sure that everyone can participate and they have the needed skills without having to rely too much on outside experts coming in and helping them and be acting as consultants. Community Led Scotland has a lot of training programs, so this is very helpful. So that people can send people to get support on how to do this, how to do that, and finances is obviously a key thing. And so the Community Land Scotland does offer an infrastructure which can help community land organisations deal with some of the training needs that they have.
Okay, great. And finally, Shiri, how does community education work for you in response to challenges?
Yeah, so again, I'm wearing potentially a few hats here. So in terms of food co-ops, like I said, the whole kind of purpose of the project, obviously, it is to ensure that people have access to affordable, nutritious food, but also to develop those skills. And I kind of scribbled some notes, so I mostly will be responding to what other people said, but you know, what Danny was saying about building what is essentially, I mean, there is a context for it, it's dual power, right? And of course we want to develop dual power so that, you know, the kind of the structures that we develop now will be eventually taking down the structures that the existing structure, you know, we're building the new world in the shell of the old and so on. So we are, the whole purpose is to actually practice those skills, those decision making. So, you know, co-ops use consent decision making, all those small kind of decisions that they have to make, but they have to make them collectively, they have to make them democratically. They have to always, you know, members in all the co-ops, in whichever way they do it, they have to constantly think about all the other members and so on. So we are developing those soft skills as we go along, and we support the members to do that so that they could tackle the bigger problems collectively. And we can see this is working. So members who started organizing around food have done, you know, eviction resistance, have started other projects. Like I said, all the projects that we have here in the hub in Plymouth, they're doing loads of stuff together as co-op members. And indeed here in Camden, it was a group of co-op members that have been practicing those skills that started a local housing action campaign to defend a piece of land that is being taken over by a developer. The council has given it to a developer. So there is a local campaign, and that is organized by members. The way that we supported them, and then kind of links into what other people said, is that we brought in architects, for example, and we kind of disguise it inside a bigger education program, like peer education, corporators education program that we did a couple of years ago. But we invited architects that helped members to be able to read the plans and come up together with sets of questions that they can put to the developer, to the council, and develop the confidence that they've actually worked it out before amongst themselves and with kind of experts. And then in terms of with the housing co-op hat, just very quickly, we have, obviously funding is the major obstacle to buying any properties for co-ops or for anyone. And what my co-op has done is developed a system where large established co-ops who sit on, I think it is 90 million pounds in the co-op movement, in not just in assets but in cash, in existing large established housing co-ops who 80s housing co-ops who paid off their mortgage and so on ages ago, if they even had one, and to redistribute that to emergent co-ops. So my co-op, the latest property that we bought, was with a loan from another co-op rather than going to the banks. And that means that any interest that we generate through this transaction will remain in the co-op movement so that co-ops can build more, co-op housing. So that is a mechanism that we developed. It was, like Julia said, it involved a lot of like very, very boring and long kind of legal expertise that we were able to bring in order to facilitate that. So we developed a framework that now is available to other co-ops. So in that way, we're sharing that expertise and that knowledge and commoning this, this bit of infrastructure, legal infrastructure that we developed.
That's fine. That's great. Thank you very much, Shiri. Everyone will be relieved. We are kind of the panel part. We've got one last question. And this question's trying to look at a bigger scale of mobilization and change. So in the land justice and the people's land policy work, we started at a national scale, actually, trying to develop a land reform movement at a national level. And now we're concentrating on a city level. So the question we'd like to pose is, could you tell us briefly about your view or your practice as well about the citywide level in terms of organising for co-ops and commons and community assets at a citywide level? And also, do you have a vision within your organisation for national change? And could you briefly share it if you do? And to get us started on this last question, I'd like to invite Bonnie to begin.
Well, clearly Scotland is way ahead of England and Wales. The ambitions were so much greater. It's not for longer leases. It's not for public, partnerships with the local government. It's not for wealthy landowners sharing their resources with other people. It's a question of the people themselves need to own the land. And if you look on the Community Land Scotland website, they've got some very good articles on why land ownership matters. Because as long as land is owned either by the government or by private landowners, you're never really going to get the power to make decisions about how that land is used. And again, remember, I'm not just talking about land, I'm talking about buildings, housing, etc. So in Scotland, they've, with the Community Land Scotland, the aim has always been for the people directly to own the land and have power over that land and the decision making. And so their vision is to have this extended all over Scotland to make it the norm, not 3%, not 50%, to actually make it the norm. And this would require, which they campaign on, a number of more extensions, more land reform acts that are much more radical and that challenge the idea of private ownership of land. They would like to see, for example, people have come up with capping the amount of land a landowner can own, and or actually compulsory purchase in the case of landowners who aren't really doing what they should be doing. I mean, there's one example in the area of my where I did my research. We've got a Russian oligarch who bought a land, who owns an estate where one of my friends is working as a farm worker. So he's selling it for £67 million. He's doing it in a very tricky way. So he's not actually selling the land, he's sort of selling the, I don't know, shares in it. And so he's done it in such a way that the community, the local tenant farmers, aren't able to put in a bid for a community buyout. So there's a lot to be done to make sure that the huge amount of very large private landowners in Scotland are actually challenged. And this goes also to the so-called green landowners, and Community Land Scotland has actually done quite a lot, and there's a lot of articles on their website about the problem of carbon trading. And we've got the biggest landowner in Scotland, a Dane called Paulson, who does all this stuff with rewilding, and they do shares. He's a big wealthy landowner. He's great about letting the, and there's another guy who's used to be a head of Greenpeace who owns land, and he lets people have shares in the land. But ultimately, the power is still with those landowners who own the land. And Community Land Scotland is saying it's going to go from private landowners, no matter what they're like, to actually community land ownership. And that is their vision, and that's what they campaign on at a legislative level. And as I said, the other thing, of course, is getting more money so that there's a land fund that people can actually afford to buy. But there's a movement for this. There's a lot of people who buy into this. And I don't think we've got the same situation in England and Wales. I think people are really very unambitious when it comes to the issue of land reform. In terms of infrastructure, Community Land Scotland, I think, is a very good example for an infrastructure that could provide support, and it would be great to see something similar in England and Wales.
Okay, so you're throwing a challenge to the speakers that follow, lack of ambition within England. Starting with Shiri Cooperation Tower, do you have examples of the different cities that you're active in where at the moment you're working across the city, bringing co-ops together across one of the cities, and how does that work? And could you also say whether, because you cover many different parts of England, do you have national get-togethers at the moment, or is that something that you'd like to work towards?
Yeah, so I mean, the ambition was to develop a movement that is yeah, I mean, we never kind of limited to any kind of national borders, but it is at the moment across England. It's not, there are no actually Cooperation Town co-ops in Wales or Scotland. So, I mean, again, it's an invitation. Like I said, yeah, in the way that this project works the best is where there is on a city level, where there is a partnership with the local authority usually, or with a large community organization, which then can pay for a local organizer. And that is really how the infrastructure is built, because it's not just the physical infrastructure, it's not just the spaces where people organize, it's also the organizational infrastructure. So somebody who goes out and support people to become organizers. And that's the trajectory from a member to organizer. Everyone in a co-op is an organizer. And then there is a kind of a feedback loop between, like, you know, the more co-ops there are in a space, the more you know, the scale of, you know, the collective purchasing grows, and it makes more sense to have something like a hub like we have here in Camden. And then when there is a hub, when there is the physical infrastructure and the logistical infrastructure, it is then much easier to start more co-ops. So it's a kind of, yeah, like I said, it's a feedback loop. We keep seeing more and more co-ops. Today another co-op started in this hub in Camden, as it happens. Today was a good day. Not every day we start 2 new co-ops, but yeah. So developing this infrastructure, which means that food can be can be moved within the city. That's a very, very useful scale to kind of to organize around. It's also very easy to then develop other things like you know, projects that members organize when they are relatively near together. There hasn't been a Cooperation Town national gathering because it is just, we're talking about thousands of people. There's definitely no money in the movement to do that, and I don't know that there is. It would be nice, but I don't know that much desire to do this members kind of quite busy organizing in their area. But when we do a London-wide kind of get together, that's usually in the form of the corporators peer learning sessions. We find that we have to do very little. We have to just offer the infrastructure, and all the learning is done between the co-ops. You know, any question that is asked in one co-op has probably been asked in another co-op, and the support is, you know, then we actually see real sort of mutual support and mutual aid between co-ops. So that is a kind of a very, again, just another example of the very kind of loose way that we coordinate. We just allow people to become, to self-organize, to become organizers themselves. Yeah, and of course we encourage them to translate that to other areas beyond food. If members can take over land in London or elsewhere, that would be I'll let you know, that would be amazing.
Yes. Okay. Please do.
Yeah. And we'd love to speak again, for example, with Julia. Like we are in Hackney, for example, one of our main issues is space. There is willingness, there's loads of groups that want to organize, but we can't find a space for a hub. So maybe that is something that together we do. And again, when there is a hub, there is more organizing around other things. So there's a really good synergy between sort of a host and the co-ops.
Yeah.
That's
Okay, we'll come back on that one. Danny, in Bristol, do you call yourself, or for today we're saying Bristol Commons? Would you say that you cover most of Bristol or parts of Bristol at the moment? What's your ambition there? And then could you briefly touch on Bristol Commons as part of a national movement and the infrastructure question that might pose?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, with the Bristol Commons, because we do have the ambition to work around the whole of Bristol, and many of our workshops have been sort of strategically placed all around Bristol to sort of introduce different areas to these ideas around commons and commoning, or reintroduce in some cases. But I would say the majority of the people that sort of work within the Bristol Commons are sort of East Bristol, Central Bristol, the few from South Bristol and North Bristol. So it's kind of, I guess, quite place-based in that sense, because, you know, as we were just hearing, when you have a place and people can come together, you know, there really are so many kind of like benefits of kind of cascading the sort of the work and cross-pollinating projects, and that's really what does happen. But you know, we have got ambitions to work bioregionally. There's a really amazing organisation. I'm not sure is Maddie's still here, but also doing some work with We Are Avon. And so thinking about it more in terms of a biosphere and linking kind of like the urban and rural. And we're linking up with lots of different commons projects all over the UK. So, you know, we've closely linked with Stour Commons. We've had lots of interaction with Hastings Commons, Corporation Hull, which is a slightly different project, and others that we've met through attending other events and sort of programs where we can kind of cross-pollinate very similar projects. So a lot of the work that we're doing on a local level has certainly lots of benefit nationally, and we can do more by sort of strategically joining up our work and our efforts. You know, there's definitely been no lack of ambition, I'd have to say, certainly within the people within this movement anyway. You know, one of the tools that we've been developing is it has been very much a product of the system within which we operate, and we would like that system to change, but we recognize the kind of role of these sort of transitional tools. So an if and when contract where, you know, benevolent landlords can sign an agreement with their incumbent community organisation that they will, you know, split the difference between the kind of the value of the property assessed by independent assessors from the point of signature to the point of sale, rather than the landlord receiving all of that benefit. You know, there's lots of interesting tools that we can use in this sort of transitionary period. But ultimately, you know, we want to kind of create systems that are going to, you know, be emancipatory and different to the sort of harm that's being you know, inherent within our kind of current system. So I would say there's a lot of ambition, but we need to focus on the relationships. That's a real kind of key part of kind of commons. So rather than thinking or sort of running before we can walk, focusing on what we can control rather than what we can't is our kind of current strategy.
Okay, and finally, Juliet, how do you respond to what's gone before you in terms of
Yes.
London-wide and the national level too?
I'm agreeing with almost everyone who's spoken. I think that public land should be in community ownership and stewardship, particularly when we see the vast disposal of those assets at pace. And I guess for us, the vision is how can we organize ourselves to, to just hack that in a way that just part of what we're doing, and I'll just rephrase this, is realizing that quite a lot of local authorities in London don't even know and have a appraisal of the assets that they own until they need to dispose it. And then there's a quick piece of work that's done very haphazardly to dispose it. So what we're doing is really trying to be ahead of that and sort of do that mapping. Not us only as Stour, but as a collective of various organizations. But also we've we've found that sometimes quite a lot of local authority officers doing the best probably also lack the knowledge of some of the processes that they can use for the community's benefit. For example, Section 123 of the Land Act would allow for councils to dispose of assets way below the market rate, which has been done in Hackney, for example. But what we're normally told is that they can't do that. So I think it's sort of like how do we organize to kind of appraise those assets, have visibility of those assets that are at risk, and then find mechanisms collectively to bring that into ownership. And that can be, I think that's a conversation for us to have as an ecosystem of what that would look like. And then in terms of vision, I mean, we support the We're Right Here campaign, which is just to give us more power through the devolution bill. That's something we feel we can use probably more imminently because we have not yet done the incredible fast pieces of work we need to kind of unlock endowments and be able to have cash to sort of purchase assets outright, but also very aware that property prices in London are probably not going to go down. So what are the avenues that we have to kind of still be able to sort of take on those assets? So but principally we think we feel strongly that if we lose those assets, they're lost for good. That's just not where we want to end up.
Okay. And do you identify with any national emerging infrastructure on land reform at the moment, or would you like to at a national level?
Oh, we would like to. I think hearing what's happened in Scotland gives us some a lovely North Star to aspire to and something we can point to. I think it's always great, like us being in the room right now. It's always fantastic to hear successes and the journeys of those successes. So, from a national point of view, I think hearing other players outside of London, for example, doing things differently is really encouraging. And yeah, so I think those stats that I'll stop there, but it's certainly an appetite we feel amongst organisers and amongst communities to find different avenues and tools to utilize. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a relatively short slot now for everyone who's heard the four speakers to say anything you would like to say in response, whether it's questions or comments, and David's going to facilitate that.
Yeah, so I can't actually see anyone, but if you want to put your question in the chat, that would sort of like really help. I noticed there was one earlier from, is that you, Mel? Mel?
Hiya, I'm Mel. So you must be referring to me, but
I think so.
had a question about whether the session was going to be recorded. That was it, and that was responded to. Someone said it was, and it was going to be shared on your YouTube channel.
Yeah,
so that is great. And I'll just take the opportunity to say what a fantastic discussion. I feel like just learned so much and so much to think about and read up on, and yeah, just to thank all the speakers. And yeah, that's it. I didn't have another question. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. There was someone who posted a question earlier about examples of wealthy landowners gifting or heavily discounting their land. So that sounds like a question for you, Bonnie. Are they giving it away?
Sorry, that was me. This is Maddie. That was me. I put in a couple of questions in the chat, but I don't know what they were because I got kicked out and have had to come back in and can't see that bit of the chat anymore. So you might have to I can't.
Well, I think my main point about all of this is, and this is what the line of Community Land Scotland is that you cannot rely on anyone giving anything or philanthropy of any kind. The big landowners that are said to be good landowners are still very much wanting to keep control of their land, and a lot of them are using it for rewilding, which is fine, but that doesn't necessarily give. They're completely disconnected from the local community. So this guy Dane Paulson in the Cairngorms, he owns this big estate, Glenfeshie, and he's doing all this stuff for conservation, and he's nationally known, everyone's singing his praises, completely disconnected from anyone in the local community. It won't involve them in any way. And I really don't see the advantage of it. The whole idea of community land ownership is to just get rid of these landowners. I mean, the more we sort of start begging and asking for gifts from landowners, I think we're really accepting much too little. And it's shown in Scotland that if you have a bit of a militant approach to things and the legislation actually supported by the government, we're not talking about revolution here, we're actually talking about government legislation, which actually is giving communities the first right of refusal. So if a landowner puts the money on the property on the market, the community is the first one that gets a look at. Actually, legislation that says if a landowner is using the land in a way that's harmful to the community, then the community should be able to buy that land. So I don't really think that we should be busy trying to make friends with wealthy landowners. And as the example of the Greenpeace guy, he was the head of Greenpeace, and he's bought quite a bit of land up in Scotland, and he's offering people shares. The shares are £20,000. So for most people, we're not really talking about community participation. It's really only a bit cosmetic. So I believe that for me, even in London, I realize it's a hard slog, but that you really need to be thinking of changing land ownership, not just, and it needs to be changed in order for it to make any substantial difference. However, all the projects that people are doing now are really important in people getting the skills of organizing and building up that movement. You've got to have all these other projects before you can go for the big things. But it just seems to me that it can happen in Scotland, which is just as capitalist as anywhere else, that we certainly could be a little bit more ambitious in London and in England and Wales.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Bonnie. I think that like the psychology of hoarding, I think there's going to be some really interesting work done around that in the coming years, like why the need to hold on and rather than trusting in the collective. Thanks.
Okay, is there anyone else with questions or even just contributions and reflections on tonight's discussion?
I'd just like to build off that last point, really, about what's going on in Scotland in terms of the kind of sale of shares for this land. I think it's Jeremy Leggett, you said. The kind of the form for me is kind of like what's wrong. Essentially, it is another kind of hack of the system, but it's a limited company with centralized power that he is, in control of, and it doesn't work. But if you the hack that we're having to use to raise the funds to acquire an asset for the Bristol Commons is a community share offer, which is the asset lock is held in community, and that's a different thing. And so the form of buying shares in this current system, it's just a strategy, but it has to be embedded within the values, and the processes have to be genuinely inclusive and accessible. And I think this is where we really need to kind of be like Bonnie's doing so well, really kind of vivaciously critiquing the projects that are essentially greenwashing and culture washing, and offering alternative solutions. So yeah, just inspired to kind of know that work is really clearly going on. And yeah, it's a danger when people who have a profile like, they're Greenpeace or whatever, and they do these kinds of things. It's a real damage. And that's what capitalism does. It co-opts things, just like the building that we had was co-opted. And I've heard, Juliet and others talk about buildings that are going to be kind of co-opted by kind of capitalism processes. And we need to be really vigilant. That resistance must come alongside the collaboration, cooperation, and commoning.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danny. Is there anyone else with any comments or questions for the panelists? Sorry, I'm just going here. Someone just posted something, I can't quite see it.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because Sophie does research. I think all of us could maybe benefit from what she does. Can you see it? Oh, right there, David.
Yes.
Sophie, do you want to say anything about it?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, it might be easier if I just speak. I just thought I'd write it down because I always forget what I'm saying, like if I don't write it down first. So yeah, I'm here representing the Movement Research Unit. Originally, my one of the coordinators, Mona, was supposed to be here, but unfortunately had another appointment, so I'm stepping in for her. Yeah, my question is, I just found the topic of identifying, just what Juliet was saying about, identifying land, publicly owned land, before it gets sold off to private developers, because obviously once it's sold, it'd be very difficult to get back. And I was just wondering, one of the things that we're looking at is how the reforms, how the local auditing reforms, of which the draft accounts for local authorities, where they need to produce their draft accounts, including assets. If any organisations, this only applies to England, unfortunately. So as far as I'm aware, anyway, there might be something similar in Scotland. But the accounts are due for, the draft accounts were due for publication by June 2026, and this is to respond to, this is something that local authorities are supposed to do, but lots of non-compliant basically with their auditing requirements. Are organisations, are they looking, is this something that they're aware of, or they're kind of, would this be useful, in terms of research using these accounts, or yeah, just be interested if people are aware of it, or if this is something that they would be interested in.
Juliet, maybe, because you brought up that issue, maybe you might respond to Sophie.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued, and we've not something we've thought about, but certainly, I've heard about your incredible work through Unit 38, and actually, when we were thinking about doing a wider audit outside of Tower Hamlets, it was something we realised that in terms of just a skill set, an organisation like yours is really fundamental to this knowledge infrastructure. So I think what I'd offer here is, the question is, within various communities that are organising to either bring more transparency to disposals, I'll probably pose the question back. How do you feel your organisation fits within this wider ecosystem of communities like ours taking on assets? Because I think your work is actually quite, pivotal, because we've been sort of doing it ourselves with the resource we have, but actually this could be like an incredible collaboration across,
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the question. Yeah, so the MRU we offer, we do kind of different types of research. So generally speaking, we use open source intelligence. So using things like data sets that are already available, or sometimes utilising freedom of information requests or other requests for data. In terms of how Movement Research Unit can help, definitely, I feel like the movement MRU could be really helpful for the Stour Trust and all the organisations here as well. We work with organisations across the country, across the country and beyond. We've done things like helping organisations research into landlords, for example, find out who owns land. Also learning more about the planning process, using and sometimes funding as well. I'm aware that's something I haven't been involved with myself, but there's if you're interested in the way that that MRU could be helpful for your organisation, we'd love to talk to you more about how we can help. Have I answered your question, Juliet? Sorry.
Absolutely. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Love to see the connections being made. It's like here and now. ML, sorry, I don't know I can't remember your full name, but you also posted a question about any of the panelists sort of like forming a public commons partnership. Before I open that up, could you just what do you mean by that? What is a public commons partnership?
Yeah, thanks, David. It's a particular model that is being worked on particularly by an organisation called Abundance, and they're sort of prototyping and testing it, developing it. You can see their website is in-abundance.org or .com. So it's a particular model that brings in rather as a direct alternative to public-private partnerships and all of the terrible things that have happened because of those. It's like completely subverting that and saying to public actors, what you really need to do as under-resourced entities is to harness and do that by collaborating with them in these sort of more formalized ways. So thanks for the link in the chat.
Okay,
if anyone is looking at that.
Yeah, so I'll just open that up to any of the panelists. Does that describe the work that you're doing or the work that you want to do?
So I can maybe say, I think we, as an organization, with the sort of the political context that we come from, as organizers, we were always, we were to begin with quite cautious about collaborating even with councils, with local authorities. But I have found that since this is sort of an excellent way to actually grow and develop, almost like develop power that often operates against the local authority. With their own funding. So this is something that we practice quite a lot, actually, if that fits within that model.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments before we wrap it up? Okay, Richard, I think maybe we go over to you for the summation.
Well, it's not a summation, everyone. It's more kind of some three very brief information items, and I hope you can respond to some of them. Firstly, we've mentioned tonight about a charter, and at the moment we've got a relatively small number of organisations who've signed up to the charter. And we've got an ambition this year to get at least up to 100 organisations signing the 6-point land justice charter. So if you'd be up for that, write a quick note in chat so we can get back to you, or please email us straight after before you forget about it. We'd love to be adding people's organisations to the signatories to the charter. That's the first point. Secondly, after the online seminars, we have an in-person get together, and this may be quite difficult. I imagine that if you're outside London, but there we go. For those, at least for those in London, we have a physical get together on Sunday, the 26th of April, in the afternoon from 2 o'clock in the Mayday rooms on Fleet Street, which, if you've never been there, is an experience to visit in itself. And the main items are we're going to look at a summary of the notes from today's session, how this can be built into what's in our charter in terms of expanding on the 6 points in our charter. How we can put into practice some of the links that we've identified tonight. So we're hoping some of you will come who want to extend those links further. That would be wonderful. And the third point, which is my final information plug as well, is that we will talk about the London Land Justice Festival, which is now in its third year. And we're currently organising what happens at the event this year in July, which is on Saturday, the 25th of July at Kingsley Hall in Tower Hamlets. So this is the third version of a fair or festival on land justice, bringing together groups across London. Please make a note of that, because definitely you'd like to be there. And if you can come along to our get together in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking about what we have in mind, how we're going to put on stalls and workshops, speakers and things like that. It would be great to have your input. So that was my bit. Have I forgotten anything, David, or does that cover it all right? Anything I've forgotten there?
I posted a link to the crowdfunder as well, so if you'd give that a little boost, that would be brilliant.
Oh, okay. So
I
I
think
think we're
people have to realize that we have absolutely no funding. We're not an organization that's funded. We have about £120 in the bank account. And we would like to ideally fund ourselves rather than be doing funding applications and relying on these various basically capitalist organizations like the Body Shop and Friends Provident or whatever are behind them to fund things that we do. But so ideally, we're hoping that if everyone chipped in £5, then we could it'd be great, and we could fund our own movement rather than people spending all this time going for funding applications from some of these big organizations. So anyway, we've got a crowdfunder, and so it'd be helpful if you could spread it and maybe donate a small amount of money. Fortunately, our costs for this fair are very low. We've got a very good price for Kingsley Hall. It's £400. So but as I said, we've only got £120 in the bank, so we need to fundraise a bit more. So that's a bit of an appeal.
Okay, so those of you who've got means, it would be great if you can help us a little there. So I think we should finish now because we're getting very close to the cut-off time. Just want to thank the speakers on the panel for what everyone has been saying was very much appreciated, and great insights and togetherness there. As David's put in the chat, we've obviously got the recording from tonight, and we're going to share that, and we'll also be producing some written summaries from the contributions as well, so you don't just have to rely on listening to the full recording. So thanks everyone for coming. We may be small in number tonight, but I think it was quite a deep and detailed and connective discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it. And please look out for the third seminar in the series. It would be great to see you there.